Hi, everyone. We'll be starting in just a few minutes. Hi, everyone. We'll just be starting in another minute or so. Ellen, the floor is yours.
Good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be with you, and we continue today with the historical tropes in contemporary anti-Semitism. This seminar series brings out the perennial patterns in the phenomenon of anti-Semitism to shed light on the matter of why exactly is it the longest hatred. And the aim of the series is to elucidate the millennial themes and the variations on those themes that brings out the essence of anti-Semitism, to expose and explain why the phenomenon of anti-Semitism is at once ancient and modern, and to impart a deeper understanding of how what was once the scandal of anti-Semitism morphs into a fashionable anti-Semitism, and mostly as well to enable our participants in the seminar to recognize the phenomenon in all of its subtle manifestations and to seek ways of responding to it. Themes that have been examined include the anti-Semitic appropriation of the truth, the blood libel, the purity of blood, the drive for redemption or salvation, the invisible and ubiquitous evil ascribed to the Jews, and more. The seminar brings out the implications of theological and ideological tropes of anti-Semitism, both historical and contemporary. In the end, the series will situate contemporary anti-Semitism within the eternal context of ethical demands and ethical imperatives. It will pose the ethical questions that implicate each of us who encounters this phenomenon, the questions put to the firstborn, and this is the question: where is your brother, and what have you done? It is with such great honor that I welcome as our speaker today, Professor Sylvia Fishman. Professor Sylvia Fishman is the author of 8 books and numerous articles discussing anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism, Israel diaspora relations, Jewish identity, the interplay of American and Jewish values, transformations in the American Jewish family, the impact of Jewish education, gender, and sexuality in American Jewish life, and portrayals of Jews and Jewishness in fiction and film. She is Emerita Professor of Contemporary Jewish Life in the Near Eastern and Judaic Studies Department at Brandeis University. Professor Fishman currently edits the HBI series on gender and Jewish culture. And among other honors, Professor Fishman received the Marshall Sklar Award from the Association for the Scientific Study of Jewry and Sylvia is also an ISGAP Senior Research Fellow. I want to invite all of our participants online to remember that the chat is opened throughout Professor Fishman's discussion, and we welcome your questions as early as you would like to place them on the chat. At this point, I turn our wonderful discussion over to Professor Fishman. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for that lovely introduction, Ellen. And thank you to ISGAP for hosting this very important series of classes, which I'm honored to participate in. The reason I'm calling my comments this morning American Anti-Semitism Perceptions is because a curious thing happens when people with guns attack Jews in a synagogue or a kosher butcher store. Police and pundits and even the FBI aren't sure that these attacks are taking place because these people are trying to hurt Jews specifically. They're not sure that these actions are anti-Semitism. Even talking about the Holocaust, which was, of course, the systematic murder of millions of Jews for the purpose of ridding the world of Jews by Nazis who describe Jews as an inferior race that pollute the countries they live in. Even the murder of the Holocaust is not necessarily seen as anti-Semitism. What I'm going to talk about this morning is that inability to see anti-Semitism, even in its most unsubtle manifestations, and how it is linked to the profound confusion about who and what Jews are. Many people today don't know what anti-Jewishness is because they don't know what a Jew is. Next slide. Next slide. To see how this all works, we're going to look at three very recent incidents happened in January, just a few weeks ago. The first one is the hostage taking in Coleyville, Texas. At first, FBI special agent in charge said, well, that wasn't an act of anti-Semitism. But on the very same day that this took place, Jeffrey Cohn, who was an active member of Congregation Bethel and was one of the hostages taken, along with Rabbi Charlie Citron Walker, not only said, yes, it's an act of anti-Semitism, but he quoted the terrorist Malik Faisal Akram. That terrorist said, Jews control the banks, Jews control the government. He believed, said Jeffrey Cohn, that if he took Jews hostage, the US government would certainly release Pakistani would-be murderer Afia Siddiqui. And then Cohn said, these are classical anti-Semitic tropes. Next slide. What does that mean? Classical anti-Semitic tropes? We're going to come back to that. The second incident, a couple of weeks after the Coleyville, Texas hostage taking, actress and comedian Whoopi Goldberg, who identifies as an African-American Jew, in a much discussed incident on the television talk show The View, declared that the Holocaust was not about race, since the murder was white people doing it to white people. So y'all gonna have to fight amongst yourselves, she said. It was man's inhumanity to man rather than murder grounded in racially perceived hatreds. To give Whoopi Goldberg some credit, after a lot of intense conversations, she did retract her original statement saying, it is, that is, the Holocaust is indeed about race, because Hitler and the Nazis considered Jews to be an inferior race. Both from Goldberg's original statement and from her retraction, we learn that according to her understanding, anti-Semitism can only have authenticity as a form of racial hatred if the Jew hater mistakenly considers Jews to comprise a racial group. specifically. But if one hated Judaism, the religion, and the Jews who followed that religion, that kind of anti-Semitism would not qualify as a racial hatred. It would be merely white people doing it to white people. So much for the Crusades, the Chmielnicki massacres in Poland in the 17th century, the various ritual blood libels and pogroms, not to mention the Spanish and Portuguese inquisitions. This mode of understanding Jew hatred is not unique to Whoopi Goldberg. It is based on a binary common to 21st century progressive thinking, dividing populations up into white and persons of color categories. Some corollaries that often go with this crude binary are that whiteness is characterized by privilege and racism, while persons of color are oppressed and therefore axiomatically cannot be racist. Andrew Sullivan eloquently argues with this. He says racism can infect anyone of any race at any time. There is good and bad, racist and anti-racist in every demographic group. Next slide. The third incident was perhaps less well known, but also in January. Anti-Semitism and racism came together in fascinating ways in a new production of Shakespeare's play, The Merchant of Venice. The main role, the Jewish moneylender Shylock, who appears to be human but is then revealed to be a moral monster, who aspires to kill the Italian Christian businessman who owes him money, is played by the very distinguished Black actor, John Douglas Thompson. When familiar lines about prejudice are uttered by this powerful Black actor, those lines seem to be about race rather than about anti-Jewishness. Reviewing the production for the New York Times, Alexis Solowsky reveals that conflating, putting together hatred of Blacks with hatred of Jews diminishes our understanding of both of these hatreds. Solowsky writes, threats against American Jews have risen precipitously in recent years, as has online harassment. The hostage situation at a Texas synagogue was a sobering reminder of hatred with a long history. But anti-Blackness and anti-Semitism aren't identical, and both continue. Next slide. Now let's circle back to look at the anti-Semitism connected to the Coleyville, Texas incident again. The woman that the hostage taker wanted released herself expressed virulent anti-Semitic ideas. She said the Jews were responsible for the World Trade Center terrorist attacks on 9/11, for example. She said the Jews were the inside powers in American politics and government. She demanded that no Jews serve on her jury at her trial. Historian Jonathan Sarna points out that in Islamist circles, the favorite conspiratorial target remains the Jews. And I call our attention to the fact that the way the Jews were perceived by the hostage taker and by Siddiqui were identical. The Jews are people with a lot of power. Next slide. As I've mentioned, FBI Director Christopher Wray finally called the Coleyville, Texas attack an anti-Semitic attack 5 days later. Now, when Jeffrey Cohn said that the attack, that the language of the hostage taker expressed anti-Semitic tropes, what did he mean? What he was getting at is that you can't categorize anti-Semitism the way you do some other racial hatreds, because the Jews as a group are different than other groups. So you can't focus only on racial hatred. You can't focus only on religious hatred. And because of that, a simple binary of white and black, oppressors and oppressed, racists and the racially hated, is not an accurate description of the social conflicts we struggle with today. This binary actually makes understanding of these conflicts and dealing with them more difficult. Anti-Semitism is real, but it differs from hatreds which are exclusively, or at least primarily, about the social construction of race. Because Jews are not precisely a race, and Jews are not only a religion. Jewishness is comprised of peoplehood or ethnicity, plus religion and religious civilization, including not only religious rituals, but also languages, millennia of written texts, oral narratives, traditions, a calendar of holy days, and a full spectrum of artistic and cultural expression. This complex understanding of Jewishness is now under attack by a different kind of anti-Semitism, which we're going to talk about. Next slide. Bret Stephens writes, many people fail to recognize anti-Semitism, but the common denominator in each of these mutations is an idea about Jewish power. The old-fashioned religious anti-Semite believed that Jews had the power to kill Christ. The 19th century anti-Semites, who were the forerunners to the Nazis, also believed that Jews had the powers to kill Christ, but also manipulate kings and swindle native people of their patrimony. This is not just a journalistic lapse, Stephens writes. The concept of privilege removes the presumption of merit from those who have it. So when you hear the language of Jews and white privilege, or even Jewish privilege, what you are hearing is an erosion and erasure of Jewishness, replacing Jewish culture with all its complexities with concepts related to Marxist condemnation of capitalism. Next slide. Now, we have to recognize very quickly that this has not happened in a vacuum. There's been a lot of things going on in America for the last 5-6 years, which have influenced the flourishing both of anti-Semitism and of white supremacy. And that includes, of course, the January 6th insurrection and the continuing false claims of a stolen election, the spread of COVID-19, the coarsening of language, and the acceptance of heckling and violence. All of these things have become normalized, and they've undermined the American sense of communal values. Next slide. And these things have happened both on the right and on the left, which is what we're going to spend a little time looking at right now. Next slide, please. They've resulted in the spread of a number of untrue beliefs about the Jews, which essentially erase whole chunks of Jewish history and Jewish narratives. And you see here, these are bullets which talk about particular erasures or attempts to erase facts of Jewish history and Jewish narrative. Next slide. So on the left, we have the creation of a false binary, which really leaves no room for the Jews. Pamela Peresky, in a brilliant article, talks about the ways in which Jews are portrayed as being the epitome of whatever is negative about whiteness in today's progressive narratives. That's what she means by the word hyper-white, that whatever people see as negative aspects of whiteness is now attached to the Jews even more than it's attached to other groups. That's what the whole conversation about power is about. Jews can't be suffering from racial hatred, according to this perception, because they are hyper-white. And people who are hyper-white can't possibly be suffering from racial hatreds. These ideas are projected onto the Israel situation as well, and anti-Israel propaganda builds on these images of Jewish whiteness. Next slide, please. So there is a false binary, which we've just looked at, which frames anti-Semitic and anti-Semitic and anti-Zionist ideas. And one of the reasons that this can spread as much as it does is because if you look at the second bullet, I think it's extremely important. Younger Americans have no memory of Jews as a disadvantaged and persecuted minority, except for the fact that many of them have classes at school in Holocaust education. But of course, that's ancient history to them. They've never known a world without a strong Israel, or an Israel that's perceived as being strong. And what's really astonishing is that many of them are unaware that Jews are a very tiny minority compared to other ethnic and religious groups. Actually, reporters often have the experience of when they ask people, how many Jews do they think are in America? They think about 1/3 of America is Jewish, when it's actually somewhere around 2%. And then finally, they think of the Holocaust as one great historical tragedy among many tragedies. And because of that, they have little empathy for Israel's status as a sanctuary for people who have been persecuted and not had anywhere to go. Next slide. So we can say also that not knowing about history nourishes anti-Semitism in other ways. And this is not just when it comes to not knowing about Jewish history. I have had people in classes say to me that other countries were created naturally. Other countries were created without violence. And only Israel was created artificially. That's what they do with the UN vote. Only Israel was created artificially and with violence. So they don't know, because they don't know world history, that the modern countries of Iraq, Syria, and Lebanon, for example, were created artificially during the same time period as Israel. And because of that, Israel, which is certainly no utopia and certainly makes lots of mistakes like other real countries, is not compared to real countries, but it's evaluated according to kind of utopian standards. Next slide, please. On the right, of course, there is terrible distortion about Jews and Judaism, and there is overt anti-Semitism with often tragic results. These bullets list for us many of the recent emergences of anti-Semitic groups. So we'll look at the third one, the Proud Boys. One of the Proud Boys at the insurrection wore a 6MWE shirt, which stands for 6 million wasn't enough. It's interesting looking at the leader of the Proud Boys declaration We will confront the Zionist criminals who wish to destroy our civilization. And as we'll see, when he says that Jews want to destroy our civilization, what he's talking about is Jewish friendliness to persons of color who are immigrants to the United States. So Jews are getting blamed by the right and the left in certain ways for opposite things. Here you have a hatred of the fact that Jews are generally very pro-immigrant and have been very much involved in the effort to make life better in the United States for persons of color. Next slide, please. Here are a few, actually, there's so many new ones all the time. I don't have the Gazpacho police here on the list of statements made, but including by right-wing US congresspersons. So the anti-Semitic tropes, which are so prevalent in the right wing, are not limited to persons who don't have status. Unfortunately, they are part of the world of high status public figures as well. Next slide, please. One of the most eloquent articulations of the anti-Semitic slur against the Jews, which I think Jeffrey Cohn in the Coleyville attack was referring to, is the idea of the global oligarchy, the cosmopolitan Jewish globalists that J.D. Vance rails against, that Jews are loyal to themselves alone, and they control whichever country they live in. And as I mentioned before, that Jews attempt to bring in large groups of persons of color in order to destroy Christian America. And those were the beliefs that also animated the neo-Nazi marchers in Charlotte, North Carolina, when they said Jews will not replace us. That's what they meant. They didn't mean that Jews physically themselves would replace them as much as the Jews were bringing in others who would replace them. Next slide, please. Tucker Carlson is unfortunately a very prolific racist explicator, and he talks a lot about what he calls the great replacement theory. That's referring to exactly what we were talking about. The idea of Jews supporting caravans from South America to import immigrant persons of color. Many of them, people who subscribe to this, claim that George Soros is funding this great replacement, this Jewish great replacement. And the man who murdered 13 people at the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh believed that. When he talked about the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society, he talked about them bringing Muslims into the United States to, in quotes, weaken the white race. And the basis of this is that 3/4 of American Jews are politically liberal. They vote Democratic. They support civil rights. They are sympathetic to immigrants. That is the basis for that slur against Jews in the right-wing world. Next slide, please. So as we see, anti-Semitism on the political right and the political left overlaps. I want to turn very briefly to other kinds of perceptions. How do American Jews feel about this? What do American Jews perceive? So one of the things we see from the Pew study of American Jews 2020 is that American Jews are actually much more afraid of anti-Semitism on the right than anti-Semitism on the left. Only 37% of American Jews thought that the Democratic Party holds anti-Semitic views, compared to 69% who thought that the Republican Party includes people who have anti-Semitic views. And 3/4 of American Jews believe that the extreme political right represents a serious anti-Semitic threat, compared to 61% seeing that kind of threat on the extreme political left. So there's a lot of conversation about progressive anti-Semitism, and I think it's really important conversation. It's interesting to see that American Jews see more danger, I think, of violence from the right. Next slide, please. One thing that American Jews are very convinced of is an increase in anti-Semitism. 9 out of 10 American Jews think anti-Semitism in America is a problem, and 82% felt that it had increased a lot or somewhat. Next slide, please. Interestingly, the Jews that experience the most anti-Semitism are quite different from each other. One group is younger American Jews who are out there in the work world, and they are working with very diverse groups of people. And because of that, they encounter more anti-Semitism because of the diversity of their professional and social contacts. And a different reason, for very Orthodox Jews who are more visibly Jewish because of the clothes they wear. So they attract the attention of anti-Semites, and there's more hostile interaction in those neighborhoods as well. More than half of the very Orthodox Jews had seen anti-Semitic graffiti in their neighborhoods. Next slide, please. So I am going to conclude my comments with 2 statements. One of them is that we need 2 responses to this flourishing of anti-Semitism and fake news on both the right and the left. We need to educate ourselves and the people we interact with, and educators need to educate their students to develop the critical skills to recognize and correct anti-Semitic fake news with the truth. We need to recognize on both the right and the left anti-Semitic statements that are not supported by verifiable historical fact. We need to be able to distinguish between criticism of Israel's policies and delegitimating Israel's existence and denying the right to Jewish self-determination. Denying the right to Jewish self-determination is very much tied into what I spoke about a few minutes ago in terms of Jewish history, real Jewish experience, and the reality of Jews as a minority group that has been persecuted and that remains vulnerable. All of those things are key to understanding the right to Jewish self-determination. We need to give people the skills to recognize and correct ahistorical narratives. We need to help them to understand that Jews are more than a religion, and that Jewishness historically incorporated peoplehood, culture, and religion. We need to see that anti-Jewish episodes historically have incorporated racism and anti-Judaism, and that combination continues today. We need to help them balance positive and critical elements in narratives about Jews and Israel, and to recognize double standards when people are evaluating Israel differently than other countries. And this is a harder thing to do, but I think it's so important. We need to help them see and reject the false binary of oppressors and oppressed, white and of color, and to see that people like Jews who achieve education, financial, and occupational success are also a minority, and they are also vulnerable to oppression, experiencing persecution, and even genocide. Next slide. But, and this is a point that Dara Horn makes in her magnificent book, People Love Dead Jews, even the best education won't eradicate all anti-Semitism or convince all anti-Semites. And so we have to counter this, not just with education, but also with alertness. We need to recognize and combat anti-Semitism. We need to pay attention. We need to call it out where we see it, and we need to fight back. Thank you. I look forward to our conversation.
Thank you so much for that truly remarkable research and explication of so many things that we can explore in our own life, as well as suggestions for what we can do in the future to begin to combat this very serious problem. I'm now going to welcome questions. If you have questions, please immediately, please give us in the chat room your questions. And I have the following. This person is Professor Asher Matthias, and he asks the following. As a survivor of the Holocaust of Greek Jewry, I wasn't prepared for the unleashing of such vehement anti-Semitism in my adopted nation. Of course, this oldest social disease has been periodically present as xenophobia, at once welcoming immigrants and despising them. And here's some further information he does provide in the chat for helping us to educate the phenomenon of governments as an institution to speaking out of both sides of their mouth, being on the one hand open to the needy and the refugee, and at the same time, in so many ways, not welcoming them at all. Sylvia, would you like to address this?
Okay, this is a huge problem that Dr. Matthias has identified. Of course, saying that the government speaks out of both sides of its mouth, part of what's going on is that the government is not monolithic. There are many spokespersons, so that there are people within the government who are more sympathetic to immigrants and those who are less sympathetic to immigrants. But even if we're talking about the same person seeming to say one thing to one group and others to another group, is we have to remember that our government leaders always have one eye on the upcoming election, and they're often afraid to antagonize any one group too much. This is not to excuse the kind of hypocrisy that Dr. Matthias is describing, but it is certainly true that people who seem different than other people, which is really what you're describing, people who are immigrants and are identifiable and seem different than other people, are often occupy a position which feels more vulnerable than those who are enmeshed in the society and political life for a longer period of time.
Thank you very, very much. We'd also like to welcome Jennifer Roskis, who is with us today. We are so proud of her research over these many years. By any chance, Jennifer, would you have a question for Sylvia Barak Fishman? Okay, anytime that you are ready, anybody to propose a question, we are extremely happy to really get this underway. Since I have a question, one of your expertises is, oh, wonderful. We have a question here from Louis Fleischman. Please go ahead.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes.
All right. You spoke, Dr. Barak, you spoke about the positions of of what is called the Americans in general toward the anti-Semitism. What about American youth, I meant? what about our own youth, the Jewish American youth? Because I think there is a problem there as well. And, you know, we have seen cases such as the granddaughter of Harriet Zimmerman, who actually lives here, around here where I live, that she's the head of a strongly anti-Zionist group. So what is happening at home? You know, children of people who actually have been committed to Israel and to Zionism. And here we are, you know, the proliferation of Jews who speak out against Israel. And to a certain extent, I think disarm our Jewish youth from defending themselves when they come under attack. How do we deal with that problem?
All right, I'm so happy that you asked this question because it's something that I myself am very much involved in, looking at younger especially, but some of them are not so young anymore, American Jews who are hostile to Israel, some of them, and ignorant about Israel, others, I would say. So I think that part of it is the diminishment of Jewish feelings of vulnerability among younger American Jews. It's not just that persons who aren't Jewish see Jews as being not vulnerable. They see Jews as being part of the larger so-called white American population. It's also that younger American Jews see themselves that way. Most of them have not experienced anything that makes them feel vulnerable. And it's history to them to the extent that they know it, but it doesn't match their own personal experience. On the other hand, in the Jewish community, there's a very strong sense of be kind to the stranger because you were strangers in the land of Egypt. So these young people are raised with the value of looking around, seeing who's in trouble, and helping the person who was in trouble. That being raised with that value, which is a very good thing, that is very strong in their hearts and their perceptions. And on the other hand, they have not experienced anything to make them feel like they are people who are in trouble. This is very different than the experience of many Jewish immigrants who come to the United States, who feel quite vulnerable, who have experienced things that make them know that Jews are vulnerable to racial, anti-Semitic violence. And it's also very different than the experience of their parents and grandparents. So the grandparents, say for people who aren't recent immigrants, the grandparents grew up in neighborhoods where sometimes other kids threw rocks at them when they ran to get to the synagogue. The children of those grandparents, the parents of today's young people, were excluded from many colleges, universities, and professional programs.
Mm-hmm.
They lived in an America where Jews couldn't get into certain neighborhoods and Jews couldn't get into chemistry departments, and medical schools had quotas. But the grandchildren, the younger American Jews, they haven't experienced any of this. So when they read propaganda and when they are surrounded by propaganda, which says exactly what the hostage taker said, that Jews are people with money and power, that's their experience. They don't know any different emotionally. They don't know any different. Also, many of these young people have only minimal Jewish education. So their knowledge of Jewish history, which would also educate them about Jewish vulnerability, their knowledge of Jewish history is very thin. I think it's a kind of assimilation. if you're talking about anti-Israel younger Jews, for a lot of them, it is a kind of assimilation into the atmosphere of the college campus. I do think, though, that when you're talking about the leaders of these anti-Israel groups, something else is going on. And there, I think it is an actively, almost like you're not supposed to use the word self-hating now. It's not considered politically correct. However, I think for those young American Jews who are the leaders of some of these organizations, and some of them have organized these organizations, there is a kind of angry rejection of who they are and who their parents and grandparents are. Now, I have to also just add that some of the materials which are used against Israel are produced by Israelis. There are some left-wing Israelis and left-wing Israeli groups who produce materials which are then lifted right out of the pages of those publications, and they are used to attack Israel. It's a complicated problem, and I'm happy you raised it.
Thank you so much. We have questions.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. We have questions coming in, and Jennifer Roskis, you are next.
Unmute yourself, Jennifer.
Okay, hi. First of all, as always, your analysis and your presentation are outstanding, so thank you very much. I'm wondering whether you can think of any initiatives or programs that have been helpful in fighting anti-Semitism. I'm not referring to organizations which call attention to increases in or sounding an alarm about growing incidents of anti-Semitism, but actually trying to turn it around and fighting on behalf of Jews.
I think that there actually are a number of wonderful initiatives. Of course, I would cite ISGAP, which has classes like these. And actually classes, one of the things that's unique is that ISGAP's sphere of influence, shall we say, is international, and that that there is an attempt to educate educators all over the world to help people see anti-Semitism, recognize it, and combat it. There's another wonderful initiative, the Academic Engagement Network, which works very hard on American college campuses to educate the educators, and I think has very, very important impact. But I wouldn't take out of the group of people fighting anti-Semitism those that identify it, because I would say that the Anti-Defamation League, for example, it doesn't just put its finger on where the anti-Semitism is taking place. It also educates people about the facts, which is necessary for the pushback. There are a number of organizations in individual regions of the United States and on individual college campuses. I do think that Israel education on college campuses is a very important way of combating these mistaken beliefs about Israel. And I think that Judaic studies courses are a very important way of helping people to understand what Jews actually are. I would love to see some of that information and materials moved back into the teen years. I would say that in terms of discouraging Jews from feeling anti-Semitic and anti-Israel, that all the Israel trips of any kind are useful. One cannot control what people will see and what they will feel, but still there is something about being able to picture actual Jews and actual Israelis as human beings, which is a very, very powerful antidote to the demonization of Israel and Israelis. So I think that, Jennifer, there really is a lot going on. More needs to happen, but we have an infrastructure that we can build on now, and we should try to support many different kinds of educational ventures and experiential ventures like this.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Next, we turn to a dear colleague and just wonderful person we have all worked with. Professor Elon Troen asks the following question. You contextualize anti-Semitism in terms of right and left. Would you suggest that traditional theology of supersessionism is a diminished force today? Or is there still a strong component of traditional theology in anti-Semitism?
Hi, Elon. Yes, supersessionism, unfortunately, is alive and well today. I actually have often found the accusations against Jews for appropriating other people's cultures kind of hilarious, because we are talking about a group of people whose religion was then used as the basis for two other monotheistic religions without getting much credit for it. And if we think about the accusations of Jews not being indigenous in Israel, well, you know, if people are living in a place and you throw them out and then you throw them out again and then you throw them out again, they might not all be living in that place when you come to count who the indigenous peoples are. So yes, historical, theological hatred of the Jews has been remade, has morphed into different forms. I really see this recreation of the Jews as hyper white as a form of supersessionism. And I think it's really important for us to understand how those historical anti-Semitic hatreds and intellectually based hatreds are unfortunately readapted and remade for every new age.
Thank you very, very much. I have another question. On many of our campuses, there is a growing new hire within the administration referred to as the Officer of Diversity, Inclusion, and Equity. And is there research on the extent to which they are familiar with things Jewish, so that when faculty and students approach this new administrator, that they have an understanding of the particularity of what the student or faculty member is saying? Can you address that?
So I think that since these officers of diversity, inclusion, and equity are human beings, individual human beings that have uneven backgrounds. So I'm not going to answer for them as a group. I think it's a great question, but I don't know that anyone's done a study where we could say, you know, 37% of them are like this and 43% of them are like that. So what I'm gonna talk about is the spectrum. I think that there are persons who hold that office who are aware of Jews and Jewishness and who see Jews as a minority who can be vulnerable. I do not think that's the majority of people holding this office. That's my impression. I think that because of this binary that I described, the binary of white persons who are colonialist and racist and privileged and enjoy the meritocracy, but they don't deserve anything they've got. And then there's the persons of color who don't have any of those things, and they see their job as protecting the non-white people. But for many of them, they totally buy that binary. And that's one of the reasons I emphasize the binary so much, because I think it's important for us to see it and to call it out all the time. And it's not a matter of what are your latest atrocities. I think it's a matter of being cognizant of history and of making people pay attention to the facts. Now, strategically, however, I think there's nothing in it for persons who care about Jews, Judaism, and Israel. There's nothing in it for us in bad-mouthing officers of diversity, inclusion, and equality. You can't, it's like, when did you stop beating your wife? You can't get any, it's not going to be helpful. So I think it's really important to maintain good relationships for holding that, that office, and trying to work with them, trying to bring programs to campus and get them to co-sponsor. That's what I would say is a great strategy, because you go to them, you throw yourselves on their mercy. We would so love to have your support, and here's why it fits into your mandate. Get them to co-sponsor, but always in friendship, not to create an adversarial interaction, because it's not going to be helpful to what we're working for.
Right. Excellent. I think we have one more question. Professor Matthias, would you like to ask another question?
Yes, I'm so delighted to be with you. I just want to tell you that two things about the Greek Jewish population. There are fewer than 5,000 Jews remaining in Greece, yet the desecration of cemeteries, Jewish cemeteries, synagogues, and monuments, Holocaust monuments, go apace. Here, I am confronted. I do much public speaking for the Holocaust Museum in Glen Cove, and for names, not numbers. And I encounter ignorance, intolerance, and bigotry aplenty. Again, the power that you mentioned, Professor, if that is so, if we are so omnipotent, where do I go to claim my slice of pizza, my slice of power? And the unity, there is no unity. All I invite people to come to the 5 towns in the south shore of Long Island, and we have all kinds of disputes. So unity is not. And Greece was the only country, the only European and Christian country to vote against the Resolution 181, against the birth of a Jewish state. And the Greek Orthodox Church, speaking of Orthodoxy in general in the Eastern, now with Ukraine and the Russian churches as well, they continue, unlike the Catholic Church, they continue to preach daily in the Catechism that Jews are responsible for the crucifixion. So this is embedded. I am so delighted that we made it out of Greece. I frequently lead services in the morning for Minyan, and we have the 18 initial blessings. But for me, I have a 19th. I look up for my late parents and I say, thank you for bringing us to America. New York is not America, and America is not New York, to be sure. But in my next life, I can tell you emphatically, I would like to be born American. I don't want to go through immigration.
Well, thank you very much. And I think you should just keep on fighting the good fight, which you are.
Yes, thank you.
Just a brief also response. Thank you very, very much, Asher. I do want to share with you.
By the way, my name is Mattathias, like the Maccabees, not Matthias. There are many Matthiases, but in the telephone book, there's only one Mattathias.
Thank you so much for that correction. I appreciate it.
So, right.
I do have some positive news regarding the Greek community, and that is one of our strongest advocate groups in the United States for the Jewish community is the American Jewish Committee. And we have many cooperative relationships with different ethnic and nationalities and religious groups, etc. And one of our strongest in Chicago, where I live, one of our strongest relationships that has been for years is with the greater Chicago Greek community, with the Jewish community. And I want to tell you, it has been a privilege to work with them on their support of so many of our issues and our support of them. And it's been really wonderful. I'd also like to mention that even though we're running out of time, Nora Schultz has written to us to say that she will be presenting at the summer conference for ISGAP her research on diversity, equity, and inclusion. So we are really, really excited about that. And that brings us to our conclusion. First, our unbelievable thank you to a wonderful presentation by Sylvia Fishman, who is it has been just marvelous to be with you. And to really encourage our listeners, please keep up with ISGAP. We offer amazing videos and opportunities to hear from you and for you to enroll in many of our upcoming events. So, and until our next time of all being together, please everyone be healthy. The world is at a very critical juncture. Our prayers are with those who are suffering. And thank you to ISGAP for being a wonderful and important contributing institution to things that are positive for Jewish worldwide survival. Thank you. It's been a pleasure.